everyone. My name is Fonie Mitsopoulou, and I'm the managing editor of the Oxford Political Review. Today, we're very excited to be speaking to Professor Avi Shlaim, an Emeritus Fellow of St. Antony's College, Oxford, as well as the author of several influential accounts of Middle Eastern history and politics, focusing primarily on the Arab-Israeli conflict, starting from the 1988 collusion across the Jordan to the famous The Iron Wall, published in 2000. Today, I'd like to focus on Professor Shlaim's incoming book, Three Worlds, Memoir of an Arab Jew, due to be released in June of this year. I'm really grateful to have had the chance to read it, and I found it extremely sophisticated and colorful and digestible and just very oftentimes funny as well to read. It spans from before Professor Shlaim was born to about when he started his studies at Cambridge. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
I'd like to start off a bit about talking about your intentions behind writing this book. Did you come into it with the intention of recounting some really interesting stories that you've experienced, or was it to shed a light on these issues that you've been writing about from an academic perspective from so much time, but instead from a more personal angle?
So my academic discipline is international relations. And at Oxford, I was a professor of international relations. And my main research interest is the Arab-Israeli conflict. And most of my books deal with the Arab-Israeli conflict. So I always knew, and it is obvious, that the main victim of the Arab-Israeli conflict are the Palestinians. In 1948, when Israel was born, they suffered, and Israel called the 1948 war the War of Independence. For the Palestinians, it was the Nakba, the catastrophe. But much later in life, in the last decade or so, I began to realize that there was another category of victims of Zionism, and that is the Jews of the Arab lands. And that's when I became much more interested in the history of the Jews in Iraq and the history of my family, and the impact of the Zionist movement on our community. But I was very hesitant to write a book about myself, to write an autobiography, because I don't regard myself as an important person. It was easy to write about Middle East politics, and I've also written a biography of King Hussein of Jordan, A Life in War and Peace. And writing a biography is quite easy. It's chronological, and you have one person at the center. Anything that he was involved in, you include. And if something didn't involve him, then you leave it out. But I hesitated a long time before embarking on this book, but one major one factor that enabled me to start writing it was reading a book by an Israeli scholar, Orit Bashkin. She's a professor of history, Middle East history at Chicago, and she wrote a wonderful book, New Babylonians, a history of the Jews in Iraq in the first half of the 20th century. And it's I learned a huge amount from this book about the place of the Jews in Iraqi society. And having read that book, I was able to place my own story and my family story within the wider context of the Jews of Iraq, more broadly even Arab Jews, and the impact of the Zionist movement on Arab Jews.
Yeah, so actually on that, I was wondering, how does one even go about writing their own like history? I noticed that for a lot of it, you would talk a lot about like family members, grandparents, uncles, cousins, and how do you find, well, the first part of this question is how do you find all this detail about them? You talk about how you're how Isaac like falls in love at first sight with Masuda. I think I'm pronouncing this wrong. And how do you find this kind of, how do you go about collecting this information?
There are two ways in which I collected the information. One was as a scholar. I uh, collected and read a huge number of books and articles about Iraqi history. So I had never been an Iraq expert, but I turned myself into an expert on Iraqi history and politics. The other element in my research was the more personal one. And here the key figure was my mother, whose name was Masuda. She was named after her grandmother, Masuda, and Saida for short. Saida in Arabic means happy. She was born in Baghdad in 1924. She died in Israel a couple of years ago, age 96. She was lucid until the end. She had a phenomenal memory. And the main source for the book is my interviews with her. And so she is both the main source on the history of the family and the hero of the book. She's the central figure in the story. So I used to interview her at great length and write down everything. So I had stacks of notes with a lot of details, which I was later able to weave in. Also, when I was at school in London from the age of 15 until the age of 18, because I was about to be thrown out of high school in Israel, not because I misbehaved, but because I was a very poor student with very low grades, and I failed English outright. So that would have been the end of my academic career, but my mother was determined that it wouldn't be. So she sent me to England, and I went to school there for 3 years. And during that period, we corresponded, and I used to write to her every week in Hebrew, and she used to write to me in English, because her best language was Arabic, but her English was better than her Hebrew. So I had all these letters, which was a major source for the memoir.
I loved reading about Saida. I thought the way that you portrayed her was just like such a fantastic, headstrong, and quite funny character. And it's very lucky that she kept so many of her like resources, because you refer back to letters from the 60s, to pocketbooks where she details like money she lost in poker matches. So that's quite lucky. And it also is quite interesting to think about the oral histories of like your family being passed from her grandmother to herself to you. But I was wondering if, were you at the points where you often take a step back, how do you situate yourself within this wider, political, geopolitical context, which you often did? Because you would often zoom out and talk about the history of Iraq and, what was going on, on a wider scale at the time. And I imagine that can't be very easy, because when you're in the midst of something, it's very hard to see yourself as a part of it, if that makes sense. Like, we don't currently see ourselves as parts of the current, political movements taking place.
Let me start with my mother because she was a very colorful character, uh, highly intelligent, with wonderful social skills, and very resourceful and good at getting on with people. And she was also um, uh, very resilient, very adaptable, and she was a great storyteller. So I recount and retell many of her stories. And my favorite one is about the period after we arrived in Israel. This was in 1950. In the early 1950, when we arrived in Israel, she was about 28. She was a very beautiful woman, and she knew 4 languages because she had gone to the Alliance Israélite Universelle school for girls in Baghdad, and the medium of teaching was French, but they also taught them English, Hebrew, and Arabic. And one day in Israel, she received a letter to go to an appointment in an office. And she didn't know that, but it turned out to be the headquarters of the Mossad in Tel Aviv. And there was a man behind a big desk, um, and he said that she's just the kind of person they're looking for, meaning a spy to go to the Arab world. He said, um, uh, you lived in the Arab world, you speak Arabic fluently, you know languages, and you would be ideal, and you would have for us, and you would have a very adventurous life. And she said, it's completely out of the question. I am an Iraqi. We have such a thing as women's honor and family honor. I have 3 children, so this is completely out of the question. And she got up to leave, and the man from behind the desk got up. He went round, and he embraced her and tried to kiss her. So she gave him a huge kick, and he fell backwards and made a clanking noise. And she saw that he had a wooden leg. So he collapsed in a heap, and she made her escape. Anyway, this is one anecdote which uh, so about her, but please go back to your more serious question, and then I'll try to answer that.
I was wondering about how you made the kind of authorial, I guess, decisions on how you would situate your stories within the wider political context of the time, which you'd often take a step back, and you would tell your stories, but then you would also describe kind of what was going on at the time in politics, or you would talk about history in Iraq. And I was wondering if you could tell us a bit about your process there.
Yes, that was an issue that preoccupied me because my book is not a traditional autobiography, which is simply about the person who is writing it. And therefore, the key challenge was to interweave, to combine and interlace the personal with the political, the personal with the public. And I tried to do this as best I can by telling my story, or in the case, until we moved to Israel, the family story, but set it against the wider canvas of what was happening in Iraq at the time. And this is not as difficult as you might think. And it got easier and easier the more practice that I had. So the book is chronological, and at every stage, I tell the family story against the wider background. For example, in 1948, when the war in Palestine broke out, the Jews were very, very insecure and uneasy because they were associated with the Zionist movement. And it was a period of anxiety for Iraqi Jews and for my family, because Zionism gave the Jews a territorial dimension which they didn't have before. Until Israel was born, we were a minority in Iraq, just one minority among many. We were treated no better, but no worse than the other minorities. And there was a long tradition of religious tolerance in Iraq. So unlike Europe, which had a Jewish problem, Iraq did not have a Jewish problem, nor was there a history of anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism is a European malady. From Europe, it was exported or imported to the Middle East. And interestingly, there was no anti-Semitic literature in Arabic, so European literature had to be translated. So we, the Jews, had been in Iraq since the Babylonian exile 2.5 millennia ago. We are not newcomers. We are not outsiders. We were there long before the rise of Islam in the 7th century. But Zionism changed all that, or perhaps I should say nationalism changed all that, because nationalism is a very divisive and negative force. As John le Carre said, nationalism is not the same as patriotism. For nationalism, you need enemies. And nationalism is divisive between us and them, we and the other. Also, as Marilyn Monroe wrote in her scrapbook, nationalism stops us thinking. So the two forces that change the situation of the Jews in Iraq for the worse. One was the rise of Arab nationalism in the 1930s, and the other was the Zionist movement, which was in the process of dispossessing the Palestinians from Palestine and taking over the country. So once Israel was created, it was possible for Iraqis to say to Jews, you're not from here, you don't belong here, you're outsiders, you are the allies of the Zionists who are dispossessing our Palestinian brothers. And also there were right-wing parties like the Istiqlal, the Independence Party, which attacked the Jews and regarded them as a fifth column. Having been a very positive and constructive element in Iraqi society, the Jews now were viewed as a problem, as the outsider, and that was the background to the persecution at the official level that began a persecution of the Jews by the government after the end of the 1948 war.
So I'm going to cut this a little bit out, but Zoom has about 7 minutes left on this portion of the call. So I can ask another quick question about the more memoir side of things. Then we can take a little break. You can email me when you're ready to start again, be it 15 minutes, an hour, whenever you want. And then we can do another half hour of the more political side of things. Is that all right with you?
That's fine with me. How long have we got now?
Around 5 minutes.
Okay.
But it's a short question. If you wanna elaborate more on it afterwards, then that's also completely fine. Okay, this is where I'll recontinue. So I'm wondering how you decided on the temporal scope of your kind of memoir, because you start before you were born and you finish around the time that you start your studies at Cambridge. So how come, I'm just wondering why you cut it so early on in what ends up being like a long, illustrious career?
I have a good friend, Bernard Wasserstein, a historian, and many years ago, we were discussing Edward Said's autobiography, Out of Place, and that goes up to the end of Edward Said's university career, university studies, not career. And Edward Said was a friend of mine and someone whom I hugely admired. And Bernard Wasserstein's point was that the memoirs and autobiographies of grown-ups are not always interesting, and the autobiographies of politicians are often very dull and predictable and self-serving. The only really interesting autobiographies are of childhood, because that's the formative period. That's when interesting things happen. He gave me a title for an autobiography, and he urged me to write it. And the title was Two Worlds, the Arab world and the Jewish world. But this was many years ago, but that's what gave me the idea and the rationale for not writing a full-scale autobiography or writing about my academic career and my debates about Israel's past, but to focus on this period, which was very eventful period, not for me personally, but for my family, for the Jewish people, for Israel. And so it's an interesting period in itself. And the fact that I was a child is not important, because there are two stories. There is the story of the Jews of Iraq and my personal story.
Could you now expound a bit on your central thesis around Zionism being this imported European construct that didn't necessarily exist in the Middle East, but created tensions between, where they didn't exist before, between Jewish and Muslim communities in countries such as Iraq?
Zionism was a European phenomenon. The Jews in European countries and everywhere were a minority. And Theodor Herzl, the visionary of the Jewish state, came up with a solution to the Jewish problem in Europe, which is to have a Jewish state where the Jews were no longer a minority, but they were a majority. So that's the essence of Zionism. Zionism is a European idea for European Jews. It had no real resonance with the Jews of the Muslim spaces or the Jews in the Arab countries. My mother always used to wax lyrical about the wonderful Muslim friends that we had in Baghdad. And one day I asked her, did we have any Zionist friends? And she looked at me as if it was a very strange question. And then she said emphatically, no, Zionism is an Ashkenazi thing. It's nothing to do with us. And my family and I moved to Israel in 1950, not willingly, not of our own free will, but we were compelled to because life became intolerable and unsafe for us as Jews in Baghdad. My two grandmothers, my maternal and paternal grandmothers, came to Israel, and they lived in Israel, and they were completely cut off from the natural environment. And they used to talk about Iraq as Jannah man Allah, as paradise. And Psalm 38 says about the Jews of Babylon, by the waters of Babylon, there we sat and there we wept when we remembered Zion. But for my two grandmothers, the opposite was true. They felt as if they were in exile in Israel. And for them, it was by the waters of Zion, there we sat, there we wept when we remembered Babylon. So we didn't leave Iraq because of the lure of Zion. We left Iraq because of internal pressures and persecution of the Jews by the government after the 1948 war. And I emphasize that this was led, this persecution, this hostility to the Jews was led by the government because the Jews became a scapegoat for the defeat, the Arab defeat and Iraqi defeat in the war for Palestine. But there was also growing popular hostility towards the Jews. The whole atmosphere changed from top to bottom, and this was the context in which we had to leave. So there were both push factors and there were also pull factors from the Zionist side, because Israel, after its birth, was desperately short of manpower. There are only about 600,000 Jews in Israel, and they were desperate for manpower. And Zionism had never thought much about the Jews of the East. They only thought about the Jews of Europe. The Jewish state was going to be a state for the Jews of Europe. But the Holocaust wiped out the main reservoir of population for the Jewish state. So now, for the first time, the Zionist leaders began to look to the East. More than that, the Zionist movement played an active part in making life insecure for the Jews in Iraq. And this took the form of the Zionist underground in Baghdad, carrying out terrorist attacks, planting bombs in Jewish sites in order to accelerate the exodus of the Jews from Iraq to Israel. So Zionism was a factor in uprooting the Jews of Iraq. And individual experiences varied a great deal. My family didn't suffer very greatly, and we didn't end up in a ma'abara, in a transit camp in Israel. But for the community as a whole, the experience was like a tree being pulled up by the roots.
So this one's a bit of a big question in terms of, it's heavy, but I was just wondering to what extent does, because this is something you talk about in the book, to what extent does religion make a nation? Because on the one hand, you talk about how you are in a way a proponent of a one-state solution. You talk about how easily in Iraq, Jewish and people and Muslims could coexist until a certain point. On the other hand, you point out that when Iraq was created, it was created in a way that did not account for different religious groups. It was just everyone in their hodgepodge, like arbitrary lines being drawn by the British, and that created a lot of tensions at some point. And then as kind of a continuation of this question, I'm wondering about what your family's experience was like going to Israel, having come from a very different background and very different culture, different language from all the European Israelis. Was religion enough to create a sense of nationhood at the time?
The role of religion is not crucial in the Arab-Israeli conflict. It's a factor, but the Arab-Israeli conflict is basically a conventional geopolitical conflict about land. There were two peoples and one land. This is what the conflict is about. And to put it even more simply and crudely, it's a real estate dispute over land. But obviously, there are different layers to this conflict. Religion is one of them. And in fact, religion has been of growing importance in this conflict. For example, look at the rise of Hamas within the Palestinian community. But that's not what it is essentially about. Judaism is a religion. It's also, as Martin Buber said, a civilization. And there is a right-wing view associated with the Harvard professor Samuel Huntington called Clash of Civilizations, which says that conflict in the modern world is not between countries and nations, but between civilizations. And I think this is a really silly and superficial notion, but it was taken up by some right-wing Israelis to say that the conflict between Israel and the Palestinians is not a traditional conflict. It's not a conventional conflict. It's a clash of civilizations. And what the story of my family demonstrates is that there was nothing preordained about hostility between Muslims and Jews, Arabs and Jews. We lived very happily together for generations. It's nationalism that got in the way. So the problem that my community faced in Iraq was not a cultural one, it's a political one. We were Arab Jews. We spoke Arabic. Our culture was Arabic. Our food was Arab food, Middle Eastern food. My parents' music was a very attractive blend of Arab and Jewish music. So that's the key point in the book, that the problem which led to the displacement of the Jews of the Arab world to Israel was not cultural or religious or ideological. It was political. The Zionist project of an independent Jewish state in Israel created a deep rift between Jews on the one hand and Arabs on the other hand.
So at parts of your book, you talk about you basically explicitly challenge Zionist narratives around what went on at the time. And I want to focus specifically on this notion about the competing kind of Nakbas, the Palestinian one and the Jewish one. And I was wondering, in the Zionist narrative of this, is the Palestinian Nakba portrayed in a sense of like a retributive or kind of restorative way, as though like, we Jewish people were pushed out of our communities, over the span of centuries, and therefore we're justified to do the same and we're entitled to this? How do you understand it? Is it an eye for an eye thing, or is it something more nuanced than that?
There is a master Zionist narrative which posits that anti-Semitism in the Arab world is endemic and perennial, that there's always been anti-Semitism and persecution. That the exodus of Iraqi Jews and Jews from other Arab countries to Israel was the result of this underlying and fierce anti-Semitism. The American Jewish historian Salo Baron spoke about the lachrymose version of Jewish history, that is, Jewish history as a never-ending chain of hatred, hostility, discrimination, and persecution culminating in the Holocaust. He didn't support this narrative, but he pointed it out. And even if we concede that the lachrymose version of Jewish history fits European history, it most certainly doesn't fit the history of the Jews of the Arab countries. So what happened with the partition of Palestine was not just the displacement of the Palestinians from Palestine, the Palestinian refugee problem, and the displacement of the Jews from the Arab countries, but also there was the displacement of our history, of our genuine Eastern Jewish history. We had a different history which doesn't fit into the Zionist narrative, but the lachrymose version of Jewish history was retrospectively applied to us. And this is what, in my book, I am anxious to counter, to say, no, there were different histories. The history of the Jews in Iraq was very different and much happier, much more fruitful interaction between all religions in Iraq. And it was the creation of the State of Israel that marks the real break between Jews and Arabs.
And just a final question. I just wanted to ask about, you mentioned before the title of the book and this feeling of being between three different worlds. And I was wondering whether you could talk to like expand a bit on how your identity was formed, spending all those years in the UK, but also being raised by a family that felt distinctly Arab, but also having spent a lot of the formative years growing up in Israel, how you think this has, impacted you and, kind of taking us back to the thinking behind this book.
That's a good question. And for our listeners, I should explain the title of the book, Three Worlds, Memoir of an Arab Jew. So the three worlds are Iraq from the age of 5 to from the Iraq from when I was born in 1945 until 1950, when I was 5 years old, and we moved to Israel. Then Israel from the age of 5 to 15, and London, where I went to school from the age of 15 to 18. And when I was an international relations scholar, I didn't know anything about social history, only international history, history from above, not history from below. And very naively, I thought that we are given an identity and off we go. But when working on this memoir, trying to make sense of my own life, I learned that identity is a much more complex thing. First of all, we all have multiple identities. But secondly, we don't entirely form our own identity. It's formed for us, and not only by positive forces, but also by negative forces. In my case, my initial identity was that of an Arab Jew. There is no better way to describe my first identity. I was an Arab Jew. But in Israel, the term Arab Jew is very much frowned upon. It is said to be an ontological impossibility. You're either a Jew, in which case you're not an Arab, or you're an Arab, in which case you're not a Jew. But for me, the hyphen in Arab Jew doesn't divide. The hyphen unites. Zionism largely affected my identity. It erased my Arab identity and gave me a new identity as an Israeli, as a new Israeli. And this affected me profoundly. The book starts with an episode when I was about 10 years old, playing with my friends in the street in Ramat Gan, wearing shorts and sandals. And my father comes towards us, and he looks foreign, he looks alien. He wears a three-piece suit with a white shirt and a tie, and he speaks to me in Arabic. And I'm acutely embarrassed because Arabic is the language of the enemy. Arabic in Israel was considered a primitive and ugly language. So I'm acutely embarrassed, and I reply in monosyllables. What I wanted to say to him is, Dad, it's okay to speak Arabic at home, but in front of my friends, I'd rather you spoke to me in Hebrew. But I was very confused, and I just wished the earth would open up and swallow me. So that's just one illustration of the imposition of an identity on a young and impressionable boy. And there was also the education that we all received at school. There was a very strong Zionist element of indoctrination of them and us. All the focus was on Jewish history, on the history of the Jews of Europe. I learned nothing at school about the rich history and civilization of my own community. So identity is a very fluid thing, and one of the benefits that I gained from writing this memoir is to recapture and to gain actual pride in my identity as an Arab Jew rather than be ashamed of it. So the end result for me of writing this memoir is that I've been able to reinvent myself as an Arab Jew.
You know, it never really made much sense to me why they would choose to alienate such a big part of the people they were trying to bring over to Israel. But I guess in a way, because of the effect it had on young people like you, that, you know, they were able to convince you to take on a new identity, albeit for like a certain period of time. I guess in a way for them, they achieved their aims.
I'm very happy to have had this conversation with you, and I'm very grateful to you for going to the trouble of reading my memoir and asking so many interesting questions about it. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much for taking the time, and thank you so much for letting me read your memoir before it's out. I, you know, cannot recommend it enough to people. It's just such a great way to understand such a complex, you know, period of time, because I'm primarily a fiction reader. So for me, I was just getting really engrossed in these anecdotes, and I loved it. Thank you so much.